Hello, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen. This is DeFub21, and lo and behold, it's that time of year again, or it soon shall be. Yes, E3, the Electronic Entertainment Industry Expo, whatever the hell the full name of the event in question is at the time of this recording 2 weeks, 3 weeks and a bit away. And I thought I would do a series of videos on my perspective on things, going as it were by company. I won't cover every last one of the industry at this stage. It's simply too large and too diverse for me to cover everyone and everything, but I'll do a couple of videos with covering a couple of companies. I'll do at least 3 videos with one platform holder per video, plus a couple of third parties. Today I would like to start off with the platform holder that I suppose you could say my loyalties lie, and that is with Microsoft. I would have originally been something of a console gamer back in the kind of very late 80s, early 90s during the cartridge 16-bit era with the Sega Mega Drive, or Sega Genesis it was known in the States due to copyright issues I believe, and obviously the Super Nintendo. Over the course of the 90s, I really was primarily a PC gamer. My sister had an N64, played a good few games on that, and my friends had an N64 too, so I played a good few games on that. GoldenEye and so on, Mario Kart. But the PlayStation 1, played a bit of PlayStation 1, but that mainly, that console era mainly kind of passed me by. I never owned a Saturn, never owned a Dreamcast. And then kind of in the early 90s, the early part of the last decade, the noughties, I got my hands at a very severely discounted price with a couple of games with the GameCube, which got me back into console gaming. Eventually got a PlayStation 2, primarily for the kind of the Metal Gear series. Again, got them, I think it was secondhand when they were very cheap secondhand. And then, crucially, vitally, in holiday season 05, I procured both an Xbox 360 and a Samsung HD TV, which I can guarantee you in 05, the Samsung 32-inch HD TV was not a cheap purchase in 05. I mean, the price of them now, I mean, I could get one for literally less than half the money than I paid out for the Samsung in 2005. But it has the problem, I found myself somewhat, I suppose the best term to use is somewhat nonplussed by the new console generation to date. I did own a PlayStation 3 pretty much exclusively for its exclusive, first or third party titles. So the 360 was my go-to machine as a gaming machine. I of course had a PC built myself, and I continued to play that, and I had a Wii and I had a DS. But the 360 was my games console, and I, and certainly an awful lot of the people I know, would consider the 360 to have been one of the best consoles and one of the best kind of console eras so far seen. And I would imagine, say, 50, 60 years from now, when I suppose the modern industry is getting close to, or approximating 100 years old, and I would say the modern console industry, as it was restarted by Nintendo with the NES in the mid-80s after the early mid-80s console crash, that it was one of the best consoles and console systems ever during one of the best kind of periods for console games. It was I think people will look back on that era, 05 to, was it now, holiday 2013, as a kind of golden era in games console games. The 360, Xbox Live, the huge number. I mean, the 360 had some good first party games, Gears of War series and so on, but it was mainly about the third party games, and there were so many of them, and they were so good. I think part of that is down to the fact as well that because the cost of even a run-of-the-mill AAA boxed retail game for the 360 or the PS3 just taking into account development costs, not distribution or advertising, would be at least, certainly by mid part in that generation, would have been about 65 million US, would have meant that a game had to be genuinely good for it to succeed, and even then, many of them did not. A particular example for me would have been Blur. I was very, very fond of that game. It's made by the same people who made the first couple of Project Gotham racing games, and that game either barely broke even or lost money. And I put that studio, whose name of which I currently cannot remember, I think it was a UK studio, out of business. But I was very fond of that game. The problem, obviously, that Microsoft has, and again from my perspective, is they've got two key issues. The first, I think, could maybe be put down to, it might be a bit ageist to say this, but may have well been put down to a bit too much influence by baby boomers, both in Microsoft as a whole and in the Xbox division at the time when the system was being developed. Although that's not its formal name, it's something in devices or something, or at least it was. It's been reorganized so many times I can't remember. But the priority, I mean, if you looked at the first really kind of 6 months leading up to the first E3, where the 360 or where the Xbox One, was shown off, it very much was targeted at the non-gamer, really. The Kinect, which is the major driver for the system, being 100 quid more expensive than the PS4, really, from whether you're a core gamer or a hardcore gamer, had no real interest to you at all. And I'm saying this as I see, looking straight at my Kinect controller connected to my Xbox One. It didn't really, certainly in terms of the conventional industry, core gaming, hardcore gaming, it had no impact in its original form for the 360, and it's had no impact on the Xbox One except to make the machine considerably more expensive and critically take away money that could have been spent on the Xbox One's hardware. And that is kind of the key problem that Microsoft faces, is that fundamentally, very fundamentally, the most crucial stage in any games console's existence is when it's actually been designed, because it's a fixed hardware platform. Once the hardware has been set in stone, once the system's gone into production, that's it. And the reality is that Microsoft first wasted a huge amount of the parts budget for the Xbox One on the Kinect 2.0, which again has no real meaningful impact on what is the meat and potatoes of the industry, which is kind of core games and that are games that appeal to core and hardcore gamers. One. And two, when it came to the actual system itself, they spent way too much money of the parts budget on hardware whose sole purpose was to enable or allow the operating system to achieve the level of performance that Microsoft wanted, which was in itself being driven by them wanting to have an operating system primarily geared not so much towards gaming, but to allow for an operating system that would allow for as much multimedia functionality, as much non-gaming functionality as possible. And although, again, at this stage I don't actually own a PlayStation 4, from what I've seen of them in the real world and from what I've seen of them on videos on the net, the operating system comes across as being kind of much more bare bones. But as a result of that, it seems to be faster, it seems to be more fluid than the Xbox One's, and it again means that the core priority for the system is over the Xbox One is games. When you top that off by the fact that, one of the key consequence of this in terms of the chips in the box is that, to reiterate what's already out there, the Xbox One's graphics chip in theory has, or graphics functionality because it's a single chip, has in theory about 50% less capacity than its counterpart in the PlayStation 4. Now, there's a big difference between on paper, in theory, than in an actual real-world environment, and the gap is not as big in the real-world environment, apparently, because there are inefficiencies that have to be taken into account. But that is still, even if it isn't 50%, it's still a significant advantage, and it's an advantage that is hugely exacerbated by the fact that the single external factor that affects the kind of real-world performance you'll get out of a graphics chip or a graphics chip function in a single chip like you find in the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4 is literally the amount, not so much the amount of memory that the graphics function has access to, but the speed of it, the amount of bandwidth it has. In other words, the amount of data it can send to the graphics chip per second. And the main RAM bandwidth in the Xbox One, which runs off GDDR3 memory, which is relatively high capacity and cheap when the system went into production, certainly compared to what's in the PS4, provides only 68 gigabytes of bandwidth, while the PS4's GDDR5 memory provides, I cannot remember the exact number, but it's somewhere between, it's 170 something gigabytes, 177, 176, something like that, gigabytes of bandwidth per second, which is more than twice the main RAM bandwidth that the Xbox One has. Now, the Xbox One's design does kind of compensate for this by having a small quantity, about 32 megabytes, which is nothing, of faster RAM built into the single chip design in the Xbox One that the graphics chip has direct access to, and it provides about 100 gigabytes of bandwidth, but there's only 32 megabytes of it, which means, yes, it's fast, but it's far from flexible. And effectively, when it comes to kind of memory architecture design, Microsoft has basically repeated the sin that Nintendo started making with the GameCube, where you have a chunk of cheap but slow but cheap RAM, main RAM, and then a small chunk of much faster memory, usually sharing the same piece of silicon as the graphics function. And Nintendo's been using that since the GameCube. Even the Wii U still uses it, and it's an often criticized element of the Wii U's design, and same with the Xbox One. So yes, on paper the bandwidth gap as a result isn't quite what you might initially think because of the faster available chunk of small RAM to be found on the Xbox One, but fundamentally it's a much less flexible setup. It's much harder to develop for, and that means that developers can spend an awful lot more time on the PlayStation, on the Xbox One, getting the game to work, or their game to work in the first place. And a huge chunk of that same amount of time on PlayStation 4 development is basically spent polishing the game and getting it running as well as possible, because again, it's just easier to work with. And it's a development and performance advantage that literally didn't exist in the last generation. I mean, Sony went on about the cell processor being so capable in the PlayStation 3, and it was more powerful than the CPU on the Xbox 360, but it was considerably more difficult to develop for, and because of weaknesses in the PlayStation 3's graphics chip compared to the same component and the equivalent component in the Xbox 360, it mostly got used for doing graphics work. In other words, on paper, the PlayStation 3 was more powerful, but the performance gap wasn't massive. It was mostly negated by the difficulty of utilizing it properly and by the need to use some of it to help with graphics. And of course, crucially, completely compensated for on Microsoft's side by the 360 just being much easier to develop for because it was much more flexible. It had a more flexible graphics chip, it had a much more flexible memory setup, all 512 megabytes of RAM, which was a huge amount in the day, but is nothing compared to what's in the current consoles, was usable for anything, graphics, artificial intelligence, you name it. Well, in the PlayStation 3 that wasn't the case. So what's effectively happened, certainly with memory, is that Microsoft has gone from having the best setup with the 360, highly flexible, allowing developers as much room for maneuver as possible, to a less flexible setup and a much harder to develop one, or develop for one in the Xbox One compared to the PS4. And it is kind of, panning out. I mean, the reviews of multi-platform games that have come out to date, I mean, most recent one was The Witcher 3, was that there was a, again, PC on top, no surprise there. Then you have the PS4, and then you have the Xbox One. And it's worse than that in the sense that it's one thing if, certain fancy lighting effects have been toned down a bit, or maybe the shadows aren't as good. But in particular, The Witcher 3, there have been, again, reports of juddering, the frame rate being, unstable enough to affect gameplay, negatively, obviously, and to a much greater degree on the Xbox One than on the PS4, and the list just goes on and on. I mean, I can say without any hesitation that my Xbox One has got nothing like the level of attention and that I got it on launch day that my 360 over the same time frame received. And it has gone from a situation where my PC was generally for kind of first-person shooters, again, mouse, keyboard, and kind of strategy games, or RTS games in particular, which is a genre I'm very fond of. And then I would use the 360 for third-person shooters, first-person shooters that were exclusive to console or to 360, RPGs and things like that, just because I liked using the controller in third-person games, and I still am now using my USB 360 controller in third-person games on PC. But that's not the same. It's not the situation with the Xbox One at all, where it's just it's sitting there. The games, certainly I don't know what the situation is outside of Ireland, but the games for it are considerably more expensive than they were for the 360 brand new. The PC versions, I mean, it's one thing if the console version of the game maybe doesn't have quite the same quality of lighting, and maybe the draw distances aren't quite as good. That's one thing. But if the frame rate's all over the place and it's actually affecting gameplay and it's making it unfun or difficult to play, that's something else entirely different. And since I don't currently own a PS4, right now my PC is which is a rig I built myself, and as I've said before, I recently purchased a GTX 970, which is in it right now, obviously. As it stands, I think there's a good chance that the Xbox One won't get anything like the kind of attention from me that its predecessor did, and it's mainly down to that kind of main mistake that Microsoft made, literally in the kind of planning and design phases of the system, which is again to be maybe potentially a bit ageist, may have been down to the management at Microsoft and what the division responsible for the Xbox One, the 360. That was certain, and it is mostly dominated by baby boomers, who as a generation have never been big overall. There are exceptions to every rule, but have never been gamers to the same degree that Gen X, let alone millennials, have been, trying to kind of build a machine that would appeal to their, demographic, in the sense that it's like referring to the first 6 months after the initial reveal. It was, why in God's name did they build a machine where they spent a huge amount of time on the operating system and the hardware to allow it to support, and play broadcast television? I don't know many people who my age, or let alone younger, who watch much broadcast television. It's not necessarily because what's on broadcast television isn't what they want to watch or enjoy. It's just from their standpoint, it's just not flexible enough. I want to be able to watch a TV show when I'm ready and willing to do so, not when I have to. And with Netflix, with HBO and their new digital service and so on, and Amazon with theirs, and there may well be others who will join the game. And of course, you've got the broadcast television channels now have their own online services. You have Hulu in the States. I'm not quite sure which broadcast channels in the US use that, but again, I don't have access to it here in Ireland, so I wouldn't be able to check. But but here in Ireland, you'd have RTE Player, you have BBC iPlayer in the UK with the Channel 4 player, and so on. And that's really the future of television consumption for my generation. And the fact that they spent so much time and resources building in functionality that would appeal to my parents' generation, who just don't play video games to anything like the degree as a generation overall that, as I said, Gen X or my own generation does, just shows kind of a level of kind of lack of understanding of what the marketplace and what the consumer base liked about the 360 and what they would want in a new system. A considerable amount of transistors in the APU in the Xbox One went on move units, is what they were called, if I remember correctly. That was mostly about maximizing the performance of the operating system, I don't think that have much impact on gameplay or game design. I could, in terms of getting games running on machines, although I could be wrong on that. But right now, the Xbox One, certainly in the gaming space as it stands right now, the Xbox One is looking to me like something of an ugly stepchild of the industry. I've got more games for the PS. I've spent more money and bought more games for my PlayStation Vita than I have for the Xbox One. The only reason I have the library of games in the Xbox One I do have is because of Games with Gold, 1 to 2 free games for the Xbox One every month. And I've been, again, free games downloading them. And I have bought a few games digitally when they were on sale because or a digital copy, for instance, of probably the single game I've played the most in the Xbox One was Shadow of Mordor, which is fantastic. But I only bought that on the Xbox One because it was on sale, a digital sale for €35, and the game was going for, I think it was $74.99 in retail in the shops. And it was even competitive price-wise with versions of it I could buy on Amazon. So that's one of the reasons I bought it on the Xbox One. And it looks great on the Xbox One and does a great job. But if you're talking about, more advanced, it's not Mordor. Shadow of Mordor is not the most graphically ambitious game, which probably helps it quite a bit in terms of its performance, because the frame rate I was found to be fine, and didn't affect gameplay. Smooth controls a lot. But as you seem to be getting out more and more graphically ambitious games that are coming out for the new current gen systems, the PS4 is coming out on top, not just in terms of, it's a higher resolution and it's got better effects, or the anti-aliasing is better, so there's less edges and jaggies on things. But it's coming down to, the frame rate is better, and that's a serious issue because it does affect, gameplay. If you're talking about a game running at 30 frames a second and it's dipping down to below 20 on a regular basis, like The Witcher apparently does on the Xbox One at various points, that's a huge problem. And it certainly would give me serious hesitation over buying games for the Xbox One into the future. I mean, right now, in terms of retail games I've actually bought myself, Shadow of Mordor, I bought Alien Isolation, which I still, to my shame, haven't played. And the only reason I bought that, and I bought that even more so again as a retail copy on disc, was because Amazon was having a Black Friday sale, and I got it for less than, I think, barely 20-25 euros, somewhere between that. So it was very cheap. I would not have bought it for the Xbox One otherwise. I bought Titanfall, I think as it was and still is, the last full-priced retail game I've bought for the Xbox One. Everything else I bought has been on sale. Most of the games I have for the Xbox One are Games with Gold games. They're mostly indie games, and there are a few actually I'm going to try playing through them for videos for this channel. But right now it's looking, as particularly for someone who was a very much, I hold the Xbox 360 in very, very high regard. And this again is another problem. The second problem for the Xbox One is that it compares, if you're someone who particularly bought the 360 at launch day in 05, and you consider yourself a hardcore gamer and bought an awful lot of games for the 360, right now the Xbox One looks very, very bad. Now, admittedly, the quantity of, and more, or even equally importantly, quality of third-party games for the that have been out for the new consoles has not been great. Certainly paled in comparison to the first 12 months on the 360, in particular, Oblivion and Dead Rising. But it's still, and that in a way could be, it looks, it compares very badly to the 360. And the nightmare scenario, if you're an Xbox fan, and if you're someone like me who spent 500 quid plus on an Xbox One at day one when it launched, is that once we start seeing a constant flow of high quality, highly regarded big budget games for the new consoles, that the Xbox One gets left further and further behind because there are technical obstacles that developers just can't get around. And again, You know, if the graphics themselves aren't quite as good, that's one thing. But if the frame rate problem continues to be an issue, then that will be, frankly, for me, an absolute and utter deal breaker. And I may go back to what was my type, which is really back in the 90s, was just PC games, PC games, PC games, with the exclusion of the kind of late 80s, early 90s, where I was also a big 16-bit fan. And it really, you know, I don't. Their situation is bad, to say the very least. In terms of what they need to do for this E3, well, they're going back to the whole kind of, you know, a game releasing on both machines and turning out to look noticeably inferior, particularly because of frame rate issues on the Xbox One. That's a problem that may not go away, and that they cannot really at this stage of the game control. I think that their main priority for Microsoft, therefore, not just for this E3, but for really the rest of this console lifecycle, because they're stuck with the mistakes they made with the Xbox One's design development, the same way Sony was with the PlayStation 3. I mean, the Blu-ray drive was a financial noose around, you know, or should I say albatross around Sony's neck for the PlayStation 3's entire lifespan in particular. I think they cost, the Blu-ray drive and the PlayStation 3 I think cost $200 or something when the PlayStation 3 launched. It's an obscenely expensive component. But taking into account that that Microsoft cannot change what the mistakes they've already made vis-a-vis the hardware, the priority for them needs to be to, I suppose, try and either mitigate or get around those mistakes as much as they possibly can. There's already been some kind of reports out there online about them making updates to the development kits to get access to, if not all, of an additional CPU core's resources than at least some of them. In other words, of the 2 CPU cores that were allocated to running the operating system and background features, it seems a significant chunk of the grunt from one of those CPU cores was allocated to supporting the Kinect controller. And from what's been reported online, it seems to be the case that, or it seems to be the view of certain people online, probably if we look at things from a more technical standpoint, that Microsoft is basically freeing up processing resources that were pre-allocated for the Kinect, that they no longer can really pre-allocate for the Kinect, because the Kinect no longer comes as standard with the Xbox One. Again, it was a smart move on their side to, you know, shave down the cost of the system, but it still doesn't get around the problems of the silicon and the machine itself, because the nightmare scenario, because it is the hardware gap between the Xbox One and the PS4 is much more serious than it was between the 360 and the PS3. Microsoft really needs to kind of start producing games, either themselves through first party or maybe second party partnerships, or through exclusive deals with third parties that are exclusive to the Xbox One. And the reason for this, again, is because if, a la The Witcher 3 and other games that have come out, if third-party multi-platform games continue to keep coming off worse for wear on the Xbox One compared to their PS4 versions, that's going to be a serious problem. And again, differences in maybe the real-time shadow and lighting effects aren't as good as on the PS4. That's one thing. You know, a lot of particularly more regular core gamers rather than hardcore gamers, that's stuff they wouldn't really notice. But if it comes down to a situation where there's frame rate issues that affect gameplay, that affect the responsiveness of a game's controls, and that is a persistent issue with multi-platform third-party games, then that's going to be a serious problem for Microsoft. And the only way they can get around it is really by kind of flooding the system with exclusive games, not just in terms of things like indie games, but in terms of exclusive first party content. They need to do more deals like they did with Square Enix with the new Tomb Raider game, get console exclusivity for it for at least a limited period of time, but preferably enough time where, you know, 2 or 3 months is not enough. It'd have to be 6 months or more to make sure that enough, you know, copies of the game have been sold for their system before the PS version comes out, and to kind of minimize the outrage for any Xbox One owners who might have played their new Tomb Raider game and then completed it, and the PS4 version only comes out 3 or 4 or 5 months later. That would be a tactic. But just getting out more first-party games, and this is the same thing with the PlayStation 3. I only own the PlayStation 3 because of exclusive PlayStation 3 only games. I went out and bought the PlayStation 3 when Metal Gear Solid 4 came out. It wasn't available for the Xbox One at the time. Other games that I've bought for it would include the Uncharted games that have come out for the system, The Last of Us, which is, I think, probably one of the single best games of the last generation, certainly the best third-person game, action shooter game of the last generation, and I think a great survival horror game, which is effectively what it is. And again, I do like my hoarding of resources and rooting in every cupboard for things, so it pushed my buttons in that area in particular. But they need, for E3, for them to be successful, they need to have some unique exclusive games, first party and otherwise, that simply aren't available on the PlayStation 4, that look great, that play great, that are preferably innovative. The only really innovative kind of AAA game that came out on the current gen consoles last year was Shadow of Mordor, which is kind of the exception to the rule, that it was a game that came out on last gen hardware as well, but crucially the developers integrated into the PS4 and the Xbox One version of the game a unique piece of functionality that wasn't available in the last gen version, specifically the Nemesis system, which for controlling both the local commanders and lieutenants, in other words, the bad guy leaders, as it were, on each of the game's 2 maps. And I can say without any hesitation that it massively improved the game, and it was literally, the Nemesis system was, in my mind, make Shadow of Mordor the first true next generation console game, because it's literally something that had never been seen before, and I don't think, certainly considering everything else that Shadow of Mordor does, would have been technically feasible on last generation hardware. I could be wrong on that, but credit where credit is due. It's a very good innovation. It should hold that series, and it will be a series now, in good stead, as long as they continue to build upon it and improve it. But in terms of, again, E3 for Microsoft, they need to have new big budget games that are exclusive to the Xbox One. They have to innovate with them, not just in terms of graphics, but gameplay mechanics and so on. They need to be exclusives, because if they're multi-platform games and they're on the PS4 as well, then the Xbox One is only going to come up and look, inferior. It has been one saving grace for them, in a way that, well, not in a way, most definitely has been, that the versions of Call of Duty, which is something this is again, I'm going to talk about Activision in a bit, but the versions of Call of Duty that have come out for the Xbox One and the PS4 have been largely identical, and that's been a huge saving grace for them, because the Xbox One really is only, or the Xbox brand is really only number 1 in America. That's where the 360 had the larger install base. It was a non-entity in Japan and very much in second place in Europe. So to lose Call of Duty to the PlayStation 4, if not literally, then in terms of, well, the PS4 version is genuinely better, particularly on the old crucial frame rate and control response, would be a pretty devastating loss. And luckily it hasn't happened so far. But again, they simply cannot be dependent on third-party support the way they were, multi-platform third-party support the way they were in the last console generation, because they just don't have the hardware for it. The other thing they can do that is very much under their control, unlike, again, the now set in stone forever hardware in the Xbox One, is Xbox Live. It was, again, another huge selling point for the 360, the online multiplayer functionality. It considered the fact that VoIP was built into the operating system, so it was standard in every game. The fact that a headset came with every kind of well, it didn't come with the stripped down cheaper version of the 360, but what idiots bought that system? I actually don't know anyone who bought that machine myself personally. They always went for the higher premium version that was known early on, then it became the ultimate or the elite version later on of the hardware, which came with the hard drive and the headset. But putting in money and resources into work and work into the Xbox Live service to re-establish it as being considerably better than the PlayStation Network would be whether they'll do it or not, I don't know, but it would be a serious step in the right direction, because particularly with games like Call of Duty and online multiplayer games, the 360 was king in the last generation, and getting those online services back up to a much better standard than Sony's, I think would help Microsoft's cause quite a bit. In terms, again, this me being kind of an old fogey, reminiscing about the past, the problem with Xbox Live, and one of the kind of prevailing experiences I've had with it since I got the Xbox One, and even when I had with the 360 in the last couple, not more than a couple of years after it hit the market, is that while effectively every version of the machine of certainly the vast bulk of the 360s that were sold in the end out there, and certainly I think every Xbox One comes with the headset, the use of VoIP appears to be at a nigh all-time low on Xbox Live. I rarely run into a game or play a game, Titanfall or anything else, where there's any kind of significant number of people actually using it. And the reason for this, again, is because the Xbox Live kind of VoIP environment has become so toxic. Again, mostly because, not actually because of adults, but because of bloody kids spouting off a lot of, racist, sexist, homophobic, hate speech of one kind or another has really kind of ruined the environment. And if I were Microsoft, I would be looking into trying to clamp down on that very dramatically. And that doesn't necessarily mean taking these people and banning them from Xbox Live. What you're seeing in other companies are doing with their online services or their online games is they're effectively creating a sin bin where anyone who misbehaves and behaves in that manner is getting dumped into it, where they can still play online, but only with people who have likewise been dumped into the same sin bin for the same kind of behavior. That would hugely increase the quality of the experience in Xbox Live. And the fact is, as I think I've said already, for me, the height, the peak for Xbox Live was in the first maybe 2 years the 360 was on the market, when it was simply too expensive for most kids to be able to go out or have their parents go out and buy one, or their parents simply wouldn't buy them one. And so it was mostly kind of 20-something and older guys, and plus a few women, and a growing number of women over the generation, who had the system at that stage in the first 2 years, and things were an awful lot more civilized. You might get someone calling you an effing idiot from time to time, and worse language than that, but it wasn't the kind of really kind of childish misbehavior that has ruined online gaming and VoIP, both on Xbox Live and on PlayStation Network. And if Microsoft could bring out some kind of new methodology, as it were, for nipping that in the bud. I mean, one particular thing, I don't know if they have the capability to do it, but since they built and Sony did the same thing, built their hardware when it came to the operating systems on both machines with room for growth in mind, the ability to have the operating system automatically, using the hardware resources it has access to automatically record any VoIP the player is receiving in a multiplayer game, where each sound or each source of sound is identified by exactly who is making it or who it was coming from, would be hugely useful. In other words, if I'm playing a game of Titanfall and the only other person on VoIP, which is happen from time to time, is someone who is just constantly spouting off the N word, the F word, or something else, if that audio was being recorded in real time, and once the match was over, I could go through the audio recording through an easy menu, find the person who was spouting off, and then instantly report them through an automated system with a copy of the audio where they were, saying what they were saying, would be automatically kind of uploaded to Microsoft. That form of a system, they'd have to automate it, which they could do with the voice recognition technology being at the state that it is. They could automatically have it recognizing the N word and another, and when I say the F word, I don't mean F-U-C-K, I mean F-A-G-G-O-T. have voice recognition software in place that would check the recording once it was uploaded and automatically kind of red light it to an actual Microsoft employee at Xbox Live if the relevant words and terminology was found, and then if not, ban that person from the service, throw them into a sin bin, as it were, then I think it's very, very likely you could weed out, if not all, then most of the people who are responsible for this kind of behavior quite quickly. And it really has, they have had a really disproportionate impact on Xbox Live, and I'd say on PlayStation Network too, because there's just no one using VoIP. No one. I don't think it has been years and years since I have played a game of Xbox Live with total strangers where even half the people playing were using mics or were using VoIP at all. And in many, particularly team-based games, that hugely undermines the experiences. And Ghost Recon 1 and 2 were hugely fun for me in multiplayer because everyone was using headsets, because it was being played in a kind of coordinated team fashion, and because it was such great fun. So for me, again, I think the priority for Microsoft, they need exclusive games that are not multi-platform and therefore cannot be compared negatively to the PS4 versions. They need a lot of exclusive games, one way or the other, first and third party. Improving the Xbox Live service, as I have suggested. There are many other ways they could do it as well, but that's, I think, really a key one, to get it to the point where the service is seen as being as superior to PlayStation Network as it was during much of the 360 era, would also be hugely important. The one thing to look out for, therefore, from what I've said, is if the Xbox One press conference is dominated by third-party games. If you've got some footage of that Star Wars Battlefront game, that's all very well and good. But unless the guys at DICE are able to work a miracle, the PS4 version will look better, and therefore it's not really in Microsoft's interest to push multi-platform games. It's shocking enough to say it, and they certainly need to push them to make sure they're looked to the place that the third parties can go to make money. But they really, really, really need exclusive games. They need to talk about those exclusively, because going on about the next game from CD Projekt, their Cyberpunk game, open world game, the RPG that'll be coming after Witcher 3 at some point, or many other kind of multi-platform games I'm sure get shown off, is likely at this E3 is likely to turn around and bite them on the rear come their release, when the PS4 version is seen as superior. And again, the graphics being not quite as good as one thing, frame rate, that's a huge issue. Huge issue. I waited over a year for Grand Theft Auto 5 to come out on PC purely to get 60 frames a second. Now, most of the games will probably be on the PS4 and the 360, or the PS4 and the Xbox One, will likely be 30 frames a second games this generation, as it was the case of a lot of games last gen. But if the quality, if there are frame rate issues, if they're dropping it all over the place on the Xbox One, with stuttering and all the rest, that is likely to cause, it'll be a disaster, and it'll eventually cause the Xbox One sales to plateau and then to decline much more quickly than the PS4s, because right now, I think to a not insignificant degree, Microsoft is still riding on good vibes left over among its the 360's fan base, and those good vibes won't last forever. I was at this point in the video going to comment next on Activision and then Konami, but this video is now run to be over 44 minutes and continuing on in length, 44 minutes and counting, and that's I didn't think I could talk about Microsoft for that long. But again, it is being something of a 360 loyalist. It is something that I've got a lot to say about. If you agree or disagree with my viewpoints, please let me know in the comments. If you have any positive criticism on the video about what I could do better, please let me know. Positive criticism will be definitely welcomed. I want to get better and better at this. And I shall leave, I think, Activision and Konami to a separate video. For the moment, if you enjoyed the video, please like it. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. And this is DeFub21 signing off. Toodaloo.